Hey, what happened?
Well, thank goodness.
You're not allowed to do that. So Kim is retired forest, so you have former forest staffing plans. All right, are we ready? All right, hello and welcome to our annual Pend Oreille County Reads event hosted by the Pend Oreille County Library District. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jennifer Hampson. I'm the branch manager for the Ione and Metaline Falls Libraries, and I'm so excited to host this event today. This year for our read, we chose Mr. Egan's book, The Big Burn. This year we've have the honor of hosting New York Times bestselling author Timothy Egan. Mr. Egan is a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter, a popular columnist, and a National Book Award-winning author of 11 books. This year for our read, like I said, we read Mr. Egan's book, The Big Burn, Teddy Roosevelt and the Fire That Saved America, which was a New York Times bestseller and a basis for a PBS documentary of the same name. Please join me in thanking our friends of the library groups for participating in our county reads and helping the district spread the word of our event, the Cutter Theater for providing lunch in our lovely venue that we get to host this event in, and of course Mr. Egan for taking the time to travel to our little corner of Washington State to speak with us about his book that took place so close to our home. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you all for coming out on this just stupendously beautiful day. Thank you for bringing me here. A gorgeous drive up from Spokane. I just was off the road several times, even when I was on the detour. I was so enraptured of the scenery, I went past the road closed sign for almost 20 miles until a guy said, "You know, you can't go any further, right?" I said, "Oh, really?" So I had to turn around and go all the way back. But it was all beautiful country. So this is actually the second time. It's a return visit for me to Metaline Falls. Because when I was researching my second book more than 30 years ago about Tony Beaumonte, the Pend Oreille County Sheriff, who happened to solve the oldest actively investigated and solved homicide in the history of the United States. A 54-year-old investigation. And when he finally caught the guy, you know who the murderer was? It was an ex-cop. And Beaumonte himself, he was studying the history of unsolved murders in Pend Oreille County for his master's degree at GU. And he happened to be the sheriff at the same time, so it led him down that road. So I came here, I wanted to go every place that Tony went. And I was just enthralled because this town has a soul and a grit and a resonance that you just don't see in a lot of small towns. It just speaks history. So I was really, and it's just so spectacularly beautiful too. Now I got to say, I do a lot of public speaking, probably 20 events a year. This year alone, I've been to Philadelphia and Cincinnati and Boston and Georgia, Atlanta. God, it's hot down there, and Texas, Oklahoma. But you have the distinction of being the most remote place I've spoken to. So I'm glad to put that on my resume, you know. So I'm going to tell you a story today, in the brief time that we have, about the largest wildfire in American history and what it means to all of us as a nation, what it meant to us as our founding of our Forest Service, what it means to us as Americans, every one of whom holds a deed to this public land all around us. You're born an American citizen, it's on your birth certificate. That's part of your endowment as a citizen, in part because of this fire. At least that's the case I'm going to make today. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in Spokane. We had a large family, Irish Catholic family, one after the other. My dad always said he practiced the rhythm method. The joke was it was the I got rhythm method. So kids were 1 year apart, and you know we didn't have any money at all, but we had the outdoors. And I remember camping in this big army surplus canvas tent, you know, and both my parents smoked. So it was really interesting camping. But I remember coming up here and all this wonderful stuff. And, you know, my mom always said that we were rich. And I said, rich? You know, we used to eat sugar sandwiches. She said, because we had the public land endowment, 500 million acres. We didn't need a summer home, she said. This is our summer home. And so that's how I felt growing up. It's an area equal to the size of France that you and I all own. Now, I did hear as a kid a little bit about the Big Burn. You know, it had a kind of mythic resonance to it. And you'd hear old Forest Service guys talking about the Big Burn. And occasionally, especially in Idaho, you'd see some little husk of a cedar tree or a pine tree that was left over there. And now it's in third growth, left over from this fire that burned 3 million acres in a weekend. 3 million acres, area the size of Connecticut, burned in a weekend. And I just heard bits and pieces about it, and I always really admired firefighters. I mean, most little kids like sports heroes and football players. I like smoke jumpers. I thought there was nothing more cool or heroic than men and women who strap on 100 pounds and jump out of an airplane into a flaming vertical slope. I mean, and then as I got to know them later as a New York Times reporter, I found out, well, some of them were studying for their master's degree in medieval history, and others, you know, play guitar in the cool rock band that plays at the tavern on Saturday. That they were really interesting people, but they did this amazing, dramatic, daring stuff. So I worship smoke jumpers. And, you know, Native Americans, if you spend much time around the tribes, they all have a creation myth, how their people came to be. Every tribe has a creation myth. Well, the Big Burn is the creation myth of the United States Forest Service. That's the case I'm going to make to you today. Now, the fire itself, when I finally got around to realizing I really wanted to write this story and really jump into it, I was attracted to the specter, the degree, the ferocity of the storm itself. I just thought, I've always been a weather nerd. I thought, this is so cool. Temperatures of 2,000 degrees, you know, creates his own weather system, hurricane force winds, all the stuff that when a fire really builds into this monster storm. I was going to write about this thing. And then I got into the backstory, which is Teddy Roosevelt. And anyone who studies or researches or reads the letters of Teddy Roosevelt falls in love with the guy. He was our most interesting president. And without him, we really wouldn't have much of a public land endowment. So I thought I would merge the two stories into one, and that would be the creation of the Forest Service and Teddy Roosevelt and this fire. So it was the summer of 1910. It was not unlike this summer. The spring was pretty dry. Actually, it stopped raining completely in mid-April. Never rained in May, never rained in June. And by July, they were starting to worry. It's that fire season sense, you know, when the ground just crackles. It's like walking over potato chips. And you start to think, oh my God, this is not good. And so they had a series of lightning fires. Idaho, this part of Washington, parts of Montana near Lolo, parts of British Columbia. Little strikes around it, but hadn't converged into anything yet. But they were worried. And we had never tried to fight a wildfire before in our history. This was the first time they assembled an army of people to try to find a wildfire. They said, this thing's going to go at some point. Let's see what we can do to stop it. And the people who assembled to fight it were the new Americans of the 20th century. you had so many immigrants. Collier's magazine said there were Scotsmen and Negroes and Italians and Danes and Micks and Macs and Scandinavians. You had African American Buffalo soldiers who were stationed in Wallace, about 2,000 members of that honorable group, instantly doubling the black population of Idaho, stationed there. And then at one point they opened up the jails and they let the convicts out of Missoula and parts of Spokane because they needed men. I have a chapter in this book called Men, Men, Men. Anybody with a pulse and a degree of strength, they'd pull them into this coming fire. Now they didn't know what was going to happen again, but there were a bunch of lightning strikes going around everywhere. On August 20th, it blew up. And I mean, it blew up. There were hurricane force winds, which are described as 75 miles an hour or more as a hurricane force wind. And it was what's called a Pulitzer, meaning it came out of the Palouse and started moving north up into where these little lightning fires were. And quickly, in several hours, this thing came from a bunch of lightning strikes to what would become the Big Burn. Now remember, as I said, this thing only lasted 36 hours. It was a weekend that destroyed the area the size of Connecticut. In Wallace, Idaho, which is sort of the epicenter, and if you've been through Wallace, you know it's sort of an intact historical district. When I was growing up, it was known for having prostitutes. That's all anyone said. Oh, in Wallace, Idaho. They declared martial law, and they told women and men and small children to get on the trains and try to get to Spokane. Don't go east towards Missoula, go west towards Spokane, but everyone else was under martial law. And there was a woman, her name was Pinky Adair. She was one of the great characters I found in researching this book. She was a homesteader, and she had an in-holding within the National Forest in Idaho, and she had her cabin. The forest sort of essentially conscripted her and said, you're going to be a cook for this army of firefighters. Now she had to cook for all these convicts, and she cooked, boils, vats and vats of potatoes for these people. Now I found this oral history of her when she was in her 90s. She's the last survivor of the fire of all the people who entered. In the 1970s, she sat down with someone who ran a tape recorder for 3 days, and Pinky told her story. And she said two things to me that were interesting. She said, I hated potatoes for the rest of my life. And it was the most exciting 3 days of my life. What happened was the storm hit, and everyone went into these ponds and lakes, and they would just dip their head up and get oxygen, but the fire was passing over them. They said, just jump in the water. The fire passed over them, and trees were coming down. If you look at pictures of the Big Burn, it was mainly the wind that knocked down the trees. It was like after Mount St. Helens. And you see millions and millions and millions of stands of white pine knocked down by the wind. And they were coming down all around. And they were trapping people. They were catching people, 4 foot wide, 5 foot wide trees coming down, hitting people. And Pinky got up out of that little pond she was in, that little tarn, and said, I'm not going to sit here and die and be crushed by a tree. And they said, no, you'll die if you try to leave. You'll die if you try to go. Well, she got up and she walked 22 miles over a day and a night, and all her family thought she was dead. And as I said, Pinky outlived everyone. Thank God for the University of Idaho, which recorded her story. Now, the fire leveled 5 towns, and some of these towns were kind of rough. So this was the beginning of the Forest Service, and the Forest Service was founded just a few years before under Roosevelt, and you had to go to Yale Forestry School in order to qualify to be a forest ranger. So they would send out these new graduates of the Yale Forestry School to Montana, Idaho, and Eastern Washington. It was a little bit of a cultural misfit. So 2 of them were in one of the towns that was destroyed in the fire. I think it was the town of Taft, named for our largest president. And they were just shocked because it was a wide open town with brothels and saloons, and they found bodies in the swamp. And they sent a message back to the Forest Service headquarters in Missoula saying, 2 undesirable prostitutes setting up house of business on public land. What should we do? And some, smart ass wrote back from Missoula, get 2 desirable ones. And I thought this story was apocryphal. I included it in the book, but it was too good of a story to pass up. And then about 8 years ago, I was reading in a little town in California, and some woman came up to me, and she had this yellow telegram in a plastic laminate, and it said, get 2 desirable ones. And she said, that was my grandpa. He sent that. I go, yay, it's true. So, the backstory. Now, I've taken to the point where the fire blew up. 5 towns are leveled. 100 people have been killed. There's a group led by Pulaski, after whom the Pulaski is named, that's trapped up above Wallace, and they go into this mine shaft. I think 3 of them died in there. They died because it was only about this high. They died because they drowned, actually. There was water in there, and they got water when they were laying down. But it protected most of them from the fire when it blew over. That was Pulaski, and they walked out with their shoes, their souls burned. But it hasn't been resolved yet. It's going on. It's blowing up. And then I want to cut back to the founding of the Forest Service here for a second. Teddy Roosevelt, I'll give you a little bit of the backstory. In case you don't know Teddy's story, he was a sickly child. He was asthmatic. He wore glasses, which was kind of a social stigma, 4 eyes and stuff like that. And he was told that he should never go outdoors and that he probably wouldn't live to see his 21st birthday. And what he did is he willed his way to strength. He willed his way to overcome the asthma, all the problems he had as a child. And when he was 24 years old, he was on his way as a rising political star. He'd been briefly the police commissioner of New York City, and he was also a member of the New York Assembly. Clearly marked for destiny. But on Valentine's Day, February 14, 1884, he lived in a 2-story townhouse across from Central Park on West 57th, I think. And his beautiful wife, who he was madly in love with, who had just given birth to a child a few weeks before, died of complications from the childbirth, and he was beside himself. He goes upstairs on the 2nd floor, and his mother dies on the same day. She had been sick, but he did not expect her to suddenly. So he lost the love of his life, and he lost his mother, the second woman of his life, on Valentine's Day. And I held in my hands, he was a prolific diarist, his diary entry. And on February 14th, 1884, was a giant X written across the page. It was shaky. You could see it. He was probably trembling or crying. And beneath this X, Teddy wrote, "The light has gone out of my life." And he abandoned all his responsibilities in New York, and he moved out west. He got a cabin in the Dakotas, and he spent almost 2 years by himself, essentially a hermit, working as a ranch hand, hunting. And he had always grown up with this image of the American West as this Eden, this bounty of wildlife, grizzly bears everywhere, bison herds roaming the plains. Well, he gets out there and it's nothing. They've killed all the buffalo. There were like all of 50 of them left from a herd of 60 million. That was in Yellowstone when they preserved this little, what was left, the remnant herd that had fed all the tribes all those years. So one of the things that happens to him is that he develops this sense of, my God, we've only been a country for 100 and whatever 20 years, and we're erasing the original natural bounty, the original Eden. We killed all these bison. The sky that used to be blotted with birds was empty. He was shocked at how barren the land seemed. So he develops this conservation ethic. And then he's named, goes back, resumes his political career. He's named vice president to McKinley, and everyone thinks, good, we've got rid of him because he was a reformist, and everyone was corrupt. Well, Roosevelt in his own diary said, not everyone was corrupt, perhaps 2 or 3 weren't. But the way to get rid of him was put him on the presidential ticket. But what happens? McKinley is shot. And Teddy becomes president at the age of 42, our youngest president. And he brings with him to the White House some ideas that he developed in that Dakota ranch. That, my God, maybe we've got to do something to preserve this great land that we now are straddling over. Now, Teddy wrote 14 books before his 40th birthday. He was a huge multitasker. He would go for 10-mile walks in the morning before breakfast sometimes, and then greet a long line of diplomats, and then write off, 25 letters and maybe a book review, and do all this before lunch. And he had to, though he came from wealth himself, he did not like what was happening to America. The Gilded Age, rich, the wealthy oligarchs. And he used to make fun of it. He said, "It tires me to talk to rich men. You expect a man of millions to be worth hearing, but as a rule, they don't know anything outside of their own business." So this is the guy who's president now. And he goes to his attorney general and says, "Could I create some kind of a home for wildlife?" The guy goes and researches the statutes and says, "Yeah, you probably could." So he creates the first National Wildlife Refuge for pelicans in Florida. And then he creates, in the course of his presidency, 52 wildlife refuges. There are now 560 national wildlife refuges encompassing 160 million acres. That's the first and arguably the smallest piece of his legacy in public lands, national wildlife refuges. And it's a simple concept, a home for animals that already had a home. Let's try to make it so they can coexist with us instead of before we push them all to the side. And then comes the Forest Service. Now they already had some national forests, but the Congress was really hostile towards these, so they didn't provide money for any foresters. So it was a Forest Service without a Forest Service. You had the land designated, so that's why you had the two undesirable prostitutes setting up business inside of the Kalispell, it was inside of the Lolo National Forest. And as I said, these rangers, Roosevelt funded these rangers, sent them out, and like I said, there was these culture clashes. And people thought, these guys can't last. Somebody shot and killed a forest ranger in Montana. There was a jury trial, and the killer was let go because he said, "Oh, I thought he was a deer." And so, it looked like the Forest Service was not going to last. That these men sent out, and they were all men, men sent out from the Yale School of Forestry to go oversee this huge public land endowment were not going to last. We're not going to last. Now then along comes Gifford Pinchot. He's essentially the founder of the Forest Service. And he is a very strange guy. He also came from great wealth, and this is kind of a typical American story. His family made a killing clear-cutting much of the state of Pennsylvania. And then he goes on to found the Yale School of Forestry and the United States Forest Service. He slept on a wooden pillow. He once claimed he killed a deer with a pistol, and Roosevelt said he killed a grizzly bear with a knife, so you can imagine what these two guys would talk about over cigars. Now, I always tell people this, I want to be really clear about who we're dealing with, these founders of American conservation. They wanted to preserve animals so they could kill them later. They were sportsmen. They wanted to kill a grizzly bear. They didn't want to, okay, great, now let's go out and get ourselves a trophy. So they wanted it. They were not, And Roosevelt and Pinchot had this friendship. Roosevelt's at the peak of his power as president, and Pinchot's his top advisor. They would go for these long walks, and then they would go skinny dipping in the Potomac with the Secret Service watching these two naked, powerful guys swim in there. And, I often think, God, what's the modern equivalent? We see Trump and Steve Bannon skinny dipping in the Potomac. They'd probably sink, but I just try to imagine the analog to that. Now, Pinchot lost the love of his life as well, the woman who was madly in love with. But he went to see a psychic. Psychics were all the phenom in the turn of the century. And so he claimed he could hear the love of his life, visit the love of his life, eat dinner with the love of his life, take the love of his life to the White House when she was a ghost. So for the next 15 years, he would write, this is only encoded about 20 years ago by a scholar. He would write in his diary that a clear day today, And everyone, oh great, he's commenting on the weather. They would say, not a clear day. No, that was his code for whether he saw his ghost or not. So these are the two guys that gave you your public land down. Now, Pinchot got a little ahead of his skis, as they say now. He said the first duty of the human race is to control the earth on which it lives. And okay, that was operating philosophy. He was a conservationist, but that's what he said. And then he said, in the early days, fire was considered simply and solely an act of God, against which any opposition was hopeless. It was assumed that that was the natural order of things. Today we understand that forest fires are totally within the control of man. Now he said this about 5 days before the big bird blew up. And it's almost like nature's going, you want a piece of me? I'll show you who control of man. So, one more thing. It pays to have good enemies when you're fighting a conservation fight like this. And Roosevelt and Pinchot had good enemies. These were these Gilded Age plutocrats. They didn't call them oligarchs, they called them plutocrats. It was E.H. Harriman, the railroad founder who owned a zillion acres of railroad land. It was James J. Hill, another railroad guy. It was Rockefeller, Morgan, Guggenheim, Weyerhaeuser. Rockefeller was the richest man ever until Bezos and Gates came along. And these guys despised Roosevelt, and Roosevelt despised them. Another one of his criticisms of them was he said, there is not in the world a more ignoble character than the mere money-getting American, insensitive to every duty, regardless of principle, bent only on amassing a fortune. So it's interesting, when Roosevelt was finally out of office, he went on a safari to Africa, and J.P. Morgan said, I trust some lion will do its duty. Now, I want to add more and more element to the public land story before we get to the finish on the fire here. The native people. So they lived with fire, hundreds and hundreds of years. Fire was part of it. Sometimes they would create fire, but they knew how to live with it. And when the big burn blew up, they were gone. They were moved to the margins of the reservations, so people trying to figure out what the hell was going on had no institutional memory. I found the same thing when I did my book on the Dust Bowl. This was a catastrophic thing that produced dust storms of a mile high and 200 miles wide, like a mountain range on the move. And they didn't have any people they could go to and say, hey, has this ever happened before? What did you do? They'd lost their institutional memory because the native people were out of the picture. Now, the Big Burn was a loss. If you will look at these things from a Pinchot perspective, they got their ass kicked. Like I said, 5 towns destroyed, 100 people killed. It was page 1 news all over the world. It was the first time we had tried to fight a wildfire, and they couldn't do squat against it. They didn't even have Pulaskis then. They had shovels and axes, and this thing just blew up and rolled over them and destroyed all this area. And I don't want to say destroyed, burned it, because it came back. It's got third growth forest in there now. But what happened was, this is the interesting thing and why I call it the fire that saved America. The Forest Service, which had formerly been looked down upon by the people in its midst, like, oh, who are you guys to tell us how to manage this land? Suddenly, they were heroic. And there was no more hero than Pulaski himself, who had been partially blinded. There's a picture in the book of him with a patch over his eye. And he led these survivors out of this. He led them into the mine shaft, and then he led them out of the mine shaft. They walked down to Wallace. And so they made heroes out of these people that were the fledgling Forest Service. Now, what followed, though, was a huge change in policy. The Forest Service thereafter, and for almost the entirety of the 20th century, became the Fire Service. Their job was to put out every fire. And they had, Norman McLean talks about this in his book, Young Men and Fire, they had something called the 10 o'clock rule. So if you were sitting at one of those lookouts and you saw a fire, it had to be put out by 10 o'clock the next day in your district. So they try to snuff part of nature, essentially. Part of nature, because fire is, as you know, it's from the thing here. What happened was they dramatically changed the landscape, though. by suppressing fire for that long, we have such fuel buildups now because a lot of forests are ready to go because forests need to burn. A lot of trees will not reproduce without fires. Cones will not open without fires. So they dramatically changed, it altered the thing. Now, also the interesting thing that's changed is that the national forests have never been more popular. 50-some million people live within 2 miles of a national forest, and people love them to death. Similarly, our national parks just had their largest visitation, 356 million, I think, last year. So these things have turned around completely from something that was sort of berated, something that was not understood, to something that's loved almost to death. But now, we have a tricky question right now. The year that we're in, 2025, with Roosevelt often said, what will it be like when we're a nation of 200 million people? We were then a nation of 75 million. Well, now we're a nation of 330 million. And that was part of his foresightedness, was to look ahead. But he said, what will it be like? Well, in the last 2 years, I've been to the bottom of Lake Mead, which was the lowest it had ever been since they put the dam up, and walked over this cracked surface. And until they got some rains last year, it came this close from being what's called dead pool. The water's below the level of the turbines and they can't use it down there. This is the Colorado River that feeds 22 million people. This is the artery of the arid West. And it was just chalk dry. The Great Salt Lake almost disappeared. Again, a lot of people think it will still. It got very close to almost disappearing because it got so dry and so much evaporation. And of course we have these ghost forests, and you guys see them here, the red trees, the red-needled trees, because of the beetle infestation. And that happened because beetles that used to be killed in hard winters, winter over now. The winters aren't as hard, so you see millions and millions of acres in BC, and Montana, and Washington, and Idaho, and Arizona, and Oregon, of these red-needled trees. And if you cut them open, you can see how the veins of the tree have been choked, essentially, from those beetles. That's because of our warming climate. So, you know, I'm a third-generation Westerner. I love the West. It's given me everything that's made me animated. And I worry about us. I really do. I worry about, you know, what can we do as human beings to stall what we are already doing to it. When you see these things, when you walk the bottom of Lake Mead, when you see the Great Salt Lake, when you go through these beloved forests and you wonder what's going to happen. So when I say what can we do, I can think of at least one thing. Humility, for starters. We don't need to be like Gifford Pinchot, even though Gifford Pinchot was a great guy. By the way, I met Gifford Pinchot's grandson, and you know, my portrayal of Pinchot in the book was that he was a little crazy, so I was a little hesitant to. Someone said, I was at this reception, a party, and someone said, "Oh, do you want to meet Gifford Pinchot III?" And I go, "I'm not so sure." And they go, come on, meet Gifford Pinchot III. So I go over and I shake his hand. I said, he looks at me and I said, well, what did you think of the portrayal of your grandfather? And he said, well, he had a patrician voice. He goes, you made him out to be only slightly more daft than family lore had it. I'll take that. Slightly more daft. So, you know, I imagine everyone in this room, that's why you live here. At some point in your life, maybe it's very early when you see a little frog, you know, emerging from a pond, or you catch your first trout, or you see a sunset and you really appreciate it. At some point, all of us get religion, meaning we fall in love with the outdoors. We fall in love with nature and what it can do to us. And as I said, when Roosevelt set this aside, we were 330 million people. But these people, the Roosevelts and Pinchots, were willing to look beyond themselves. They made great ancestors because they wondered what it would be like this year for us to be living and hoping that we could have some of the same sensation that they had. Now, I'll just close with a story. You know, we're going through really tough times. There's a lot of turmoil politically in our country right now. And I'm sure all of you have heard this story. It's much cited after Benjamin Franklin walked out of Independence Hall after the Constitutional Convention of 1787, and a woman shouted out, "Dr. Franklin, what have you got? A republic or a monarchy? And Franklin responded famously, a republic, if you can keep it. And I use that quote because the same sentiment applies to public land. This is our land. That's the number one thing I tell people. This is not the government's land. This is not oligarchs' land. This is our land, the citizens. We own this thing. I think we should give it the love and duty it deserves and hope we can keep it. Because as the great Wallace Stegner said, this land is the geography of hope. Thank you. So I have some time to take a couple of questions from, I'm sure, a very curious audience. Go ahead, sure.
Who's Wallace Stegner?
Wallace Stegner was a writer of the American West who grew up in Salt Lake City, and then he was a hardscrabble existence. He went all over the West. He grew up in stump towns that were just newly cut, and then he went on to become one of our greatest writers. I guess his best known book would be Angle of Repose. It's probably his best known book, yeah. A wonderful, I never got to meet him. I met his son, but I never got to meet him, but I've always revered him. Again, he had this really hardscrabble life, and it's amazing he made it out of these timber towns, but he went on to just be an extraordinary writer and a historian. Yes, sir.
Did you ever meet Greg Olson over there in Seattle? He wrote about the mine disaster in '72.
Oh, yeah, I did not meet him. I'm sorry, couldn't see in the dark there, yeah. No, I did not meet him,
Well,
no.
read his book.
I'll take the assignment. Yes.
Of all the books you've written, and you've written a number of diverse books, Pilgrimage to Eternity, Big Burn, Breaking Blue, Worst Hard Time. Of all of those, you are so eclectic in your subjects. Which one is your favorite? Which do you feel?
Yeah,
most about?
I mean, one part of me wants to be like my mother diplomatically said when someone asked her
Who's your favorite child?
who was her favorite child. She said, I love all my children equally, which wasn't true, unfortunately. No. So my mother was a huge influence on me, just a huge influence. If she hadn't had all these kids, she would have probably been a writer herself. You know? She always said she grew up at the wrong time. Yeah, that's a great question. I'll tell you the one I have to say probably is my favorite. It's the one I won the National Book Award for, is The Worst Hard Time, the Dust Bowl. And here's why. Two things. So I'm a storyteller. Some people say, oh, you're a historian. No, I'm a storyteller. I look for a story. Now the story has to be true. I don't write fiction, I write nonfiction. So everything is cited. I try not to get a single detail wrong. So I was banging around Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas Panhandle, working on a series for the New York Times about the collapse of small town America. Now, down there you really see it, because they used to have these farm towns which the railroad built every 12 miles so that people could take their corn and their grain to the depot and it could get out to the markets. Well, when agriculture collapsed from being a nation of farmers, even in the 30s, 1 in 3 people worked the land. Now it's like less than 2%, and no one knows where their food came from. But these towns are all dying, and I'm going around, and I close my notebook, and inevitably some woman, because women outlive the men, in her 90s would say, well, that's not the story of this town. I said, what is the story? They say it's what happened in the dirty 30s. I said, what do you mean? Didn't everyone go to California? I said, no. As it turned out, 2/3 of the people stayed put because their family had never had a piece of dirt before. We expanded the Homestead Act in the 20th century, so actually more ground was homesteaded in the 20th century than the 19th century. And so they had something, and they were loyal to it, even though it had betrayed them, and they weren't going to give it up. So I was so honored to go from town to town when I was putting that book together. And I'd sit in a little semicircle, and these elderly women would tell me these fabulous stories of what it was like to be 17 and 18 years old when the earth turned inside out. I mean, literally, a bright day like today at noon would go pitch black, just pitch black. and you couldn't shake someone's hand because there was static electricity before one of these storms came. And there was no social security, some of them were eating roadkill, it literally was the worst hard time. And I was hearing it from living people. Instead of having to go through the oral history I had, I could look into someone's face. You know that opening scene in the movie Titanic where Kate Winslet, or this elderly woman dissolves into Kate Winslet. That's how it was for me. I was talking to these women in their mid-90s, and suddenly I would see a little girl, a teenage girl who was at the prime of her life. So I was, I'd go back to my crappy little motel room in the Oklahoma Panhandle and almost cry. I was just so touched by these stories. So I thought, God, I'm like getting the baton, give me the baton before you die. And I'm handing it. And I'm taking that story. So I was so blessed and gratified that I could tell really a new story. Because Steinbeck told the story of the Grapes of Wrath. This is the story of the people who didn't go anywhere. So that's the first part of why I really like the book, because those women were amazing. The second part was the reception. So when I was done writing that book, I turned to my wife and I said, I think I've told an honest account. I think I've done right by these people, but no one's going to want to read this. It's called The Worst Hard Time. Hey, Merry Christmas. I mean, come on. That book has sold 1 million copies, put both my kids through college, and made it into a Ken Burns documentary. And you got to wonder why. I think it's the story of resilience. You look at what those people went through and you say, oh God, my internet's down. That's nothing by comparison. It's just nothing. A woman was telling me 2 days ago that her her teenage daughter came up to her and said, has there ever been a harder time to be alive? Oh my God. Yeah, so the reception. And then the one more thing on that. One of the women who I feature in the story, I just loved her, and her mother was a Broadway dancer who was sent out to Oklahoma because she had asthma and terrible lung disease, and she ended up getting, the dust storms just obliterated her. She ended up getting dust pneumonia, but the daughter stayed, married a cowboy, and and she was one of my heroes. She calls me up, the book's been out, it's a big success, and she says, oh my God, Tim, she said, she didn't tell the story for like 50, 60 years. It's what happens. World War II vets are the same way. They stop talking about it. They think, oh yeah, sure, Grandma. Yeah, you walked to school in a snowstorm. No one wants to hear that. But she stopped telling it. She goes, Tim, you won't believe this. Little kids are knocking on my door. They want to do their project about me. She said, the Rotary wants me to speak to them. She said, you made me like a rock star. And I just thought that was so cool. I was so touched by that. Now, all those women are gone. Yep, they were all in their 90s then. That was 20 years ago, I think, when I started doing my interviewing. But I got to tell this story. So that's a long-winded way of saying that was my favorite book. Yeah. Winner of the Ted Danson Lookalike Contest. Yeah.
So, The Worst Hard Time it's a wonderful case for resilience. I mean, it's unbelievable. For me, and maybe it's because of where I was at that time, A Pilgrimage to Eternity was one of the best cases I've ever read for theological humility. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned humility again today as a part of our hope. It's not in style.
No.
Have any counsel for us? Any hope?
Thank you for saying that. So, Pilgrimage to Eternity was the book I did just before my last book, and I went to Assumption School, Gonzaga Prep. We were Catholic, Irish Catholic through and through, about as Irish Catholic as you could be, and I let my faith lapse, like a lot of people. I read that the largest growing segment of religious identification right now in America is lapsed Catholics, so I'm not alone. So I'd let my faith lapse, and I thought, my mother had just passed, and she was a devout Catholic. And as she is dying, she's looking out the mountains. She got a horrible glioblastoma, and brain cancer just took her way too fast. But she's in this room, she's looking out Olympic Mountains. She'd moved to Squim, if you know where that is, you guys, yeah. And she's fading in and out of consciousness. I'm holding her hand, and she's saying, I'm not feeling it, meaning feeling the passage. I go, what do you mean? She goes, I don't know if there's anything out there. I said to myself, my God, she's having doubts. She's thinking, all her life she's been this devout Catholic, and she's having doubts about whether there's anything there. So her death was my prompt to do that pilgrimage. That I thought I owe it to her, I owe it to myself as a sentient human being, as a spiritual human being, to explore my faith. So I walked from Canterbury to Rome, and it was extraordinary. And thank you for saying that. But and my favorite saint then and now was Francis of Assisi, the nature saint, an amazing guy who gave up his nobleman's robes to go be with the poor and down in the malaria-infested valley of Perugia, below Perugia. So you raise a really good point. The Christian gospel is actually pretty simple, and humility is one of the virtues. But if it was a stock right now, it would be tanking. I think these things, I think everyone in this room was raised with certain virtues, and I don't know how you guys were. My parents were like, be humble. My grandmother, I can always remember, if you ever boasted about anything, even if I got a home run in Little League, that was a bad thing. So now with social media, that's all we do, is we're all the star of our own show. The only good thing, the only sort of thing that keeps me sane in that regard is I'm enough of a student of history to know we just go through these waves. We really do. So I wrote this book called The Immortal Irishman. I also really liked writing that because it allowed me to go into my Irish heritage. And I found this incredibly cool guy who was an Irish revolutionary. He was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, and his remains disposed of as Her Majesty shall see fit. And just before he was supposed to have all that happen to him, Queen Victoria commuted his sentence to lifetime banishment in Australia, in Tasmania, which is where the Brits sent their political prisoners. So he goes to the end of the world, this is 1848, to Tasmania. He escapes from Tasmania, comes to America, becomes the leading Irish-American orator, a Civil War general, leading the Irish Brigade into battle. In battle after battle, Lincoln said, these Irishmen fight better than anybody on the Union side, and then ends up as the first territorial governor of Montana. And dies under mysterious circumstances at the age of 46. What a life! So, when I was researching that book, it allowed me to look at these principles as well. And those Victorians were really into humility. They would never boast of any. It's incredible. It was even shameful to, to think of anything positive. They're almost too much into humility. So, but what I learned from that, and this is my long-winded point on this, who were the people that the older Americans hated? They hated the Irish. So there was this party called the Know Nothing Party. And in the 1850s, it was the second biggest political party in the United States. And all they wanted to do was make sure the Irish immigrants would never become citizens. So I see these things come and go, come and go, come and go, and you just see these currents run through our history. Hopefully, to your point, we're in a personality phase right now. I mean, we're so different from the Victorians, and they're so different than how the Depression generation was. I mean, our parents and grandparents are Depression era babies, and you know how they are. They still have their first nickel. I mean, they cut coupons. They think Costco's expensive. So.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
So you brought up the Know Nothings. I spent 10 years on Know Nothing Creek in the Klamath National Forest.
Oh wow.
Gold mining, logging, fighting fire.
Yeah.
We lived through a major fire. But I was just thinking, I don't know if you're looking for another project. But
I'm always looking for a story.
the Klamath Dam removal has the elements of a great story.
Yeah, it does. No, I know all about it. Thank you for
Indians, hippies, salmon, I mean,
right, it's got the whole package. It's funny you said that, so I'm not there yet, but off and on I've been researching a book for the last couple of years. That's why I went to the Great Salt Lake and why I went to Lake Mead, about water in the West, how it shaped the West and what happens when you lose it. and how it's, we have this giant hydraulic system everywhere. I mean, not the Pend Oreille, the Colorado, the Columbia. We've replumbed every river to allow us to live. Electricity, rain falls from the sky and powers my home. So I was going to do this water book and kind of about being a moment of reckoning, and the Klamath was going to be a big part of it. And it's just on hold a little bit. So it's going to take me a while. It's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of stuff to cover. And I got to figure out as a storyteller, I got to figure out my thread. I don't want to bore you with the writerly details, but I got to find the storyline.
I can give you some names to people to talk to in that area.
Oh, good. Yeah, no, a lot of people have told me that you've got to do the Klamath.
Yeah.
No, it's a great story. It does have everything. And I liked your tagline. It's got, what'd you say, hippies?
Indians, hippies, and salmon.
All right. Also known as an evening in Metaline Falls.
That's right.
Anyone else?
I got one for you.
Okay.
Getting back to the big burn,
Yeah.
this fire, how close did it get to the Columbia River or the Flathead Lake? To give us an idea,
Yeah, that's a great question. So it burned right up to the edge of Flathead Lake. In fact, it was burning all around Flathead. It got into BC. It made it into Pend Oreille County, for sure.
Sherman Pass burned at the same time.
Yeah, no, exactly. So it got much of eastern Washington, all of the Idaho Panhandle, much of western Montana, southern BC. That was
so
the
it made it pretty close to the Columbia then, or what?
really close.
Yes.
Yeah, and in fact, there was a serious thought that at some point Spokane might have to be evacuated. Now you have to understand the context. This was the era when all these towns burned. Seattle burned to the ground. Denver burned to the ground. Spokane had a great fire. Chicago had a great fire. San Francisco had a great fire. These cities were made of wood. And that was the number one fear they had. People forget about it.
And they used kerosene lights.
Yeah. And all you need to do is kick one over. Exactly. So I'll take one more question, you guys. Someone else had a question. I think you did?
That was my question.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Did you ever start down the road thinking that something was completely true and everything maybe kind of indicated that it was true, and then through your research you're like, oh man, this lore was completely wrong in the end, or something like that?
Are you a writer? That happens, and it really pisses me off. Because, if I was a fiction writer, I could just make shit up. That's all fiction is. It's just, just dream my character. There's so many times where I said, I wish the character would do this. Or I go down this road thinking they're going to do this, and then it doesn't pay off. And since I write nonfiction, and I have a real, I'm just a stickler for accuracy. I footnote the crap out of these books at the end, not in the middle of the story, so that everyone can check me. And that's happened to be quite a bit. I will say one thing on the positive side of that. The aforementioned Irishman, he was a Victorian, but he wrote this beautiful 10-page letter to this woman who became the love of his life. And he said, I'm an exile. I'm a fugitive of the British Empire. I can never go home. I'll be hanged if I try to go back to Britain. Here in America, though, I'm somebody. He goes, but if you love me, I will be your closest partner. I will share everything. It's just a beautiful love letter to a woman. And I have it intact, and it's like, thank God we have that. Now, God forbid what happens to the Tim Egans 100 years from now, who have to go back and look at social media and say, dude, are you late? And they won't have any letters like that. Anyway, thanks for turning out today, guys. I appreciate it. I could sign a couple books if you have it.